morning, everyone, and hello to all of you joining us from wherever you are around the world. My name is Mohammed Salih. I'm a non-resident senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Research Institute's National Security Program here in the United States. I'm really thrilled to welcome you all to this webinar today. We will be talking about the renewed peace efforts between the Turkish government and the Kurdistan Workers Party, better known as the PKK, in Turkey. We will be also discussing the implications of this peace process for the broader region and also for U.S. policy in the Middle East. First, a little bit of history. The PKK has been fighting an insurgency against the Turkish state for the past 4 decades. Around 40,000 people are estimated to have lost their lives in this conflict, which makes the current peace for push not only the current push for peace not only critical for Turkey, but also important regionally, given in particular Turkey's stature and the PKK's transnational presence. This isn't, of course, the first attempt at peace between Turkey and the Kurds. There's quite a little bit of history to that. There was an informal attempt in the early 1990s under President Turgut Özal, but it didn't really yield much. A major formal process or effort took place between 2009 to 2015. Unfortunately, those talks also collapsed and led to renewed conflict as well. What is particularly notable this time is that the PKK's imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan, released a message on February 27, calling on his group's guerrillas in the Kandil Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan to lay down their weapons. Many observers consider this peace attempt or this round of peace between the PKK and Turkey to be more promising than previous efforts, noting greater willingness on both sides to reach some sort of a compromise. To unpack all of this today, I'm delighted to introduce 2 very distinguished experts on Turkey and the region. First, we have Gönül Tol, who is the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program and a senior fellow with their Frontier Europe initiative. Gönül is also the author of Erdogan's War, A Strong Man's Struggle at Home and in Syria. Joining us as well is Giran Ozcan, the executive director of the Kurdish Peace Institute in Washington, D.C. Giran has previously worked with the People's Democratic Party, or the HDP, or the HDP, which used to be the largest pro-Kurdish political party in Turkey until very recently. Giran has also served as the HDP's representative to the United States from 2017 to 2021. Now, before we dive into our discussion, just a few quick house rules. Please remember to silence your phones. Our conversation will run for about an hour. I'll spend roughly 45 minutes asking our guests questions, and then we will have around 15 minutes or so at the end for questions from audiences. So please feel free to submit your questions anytime through Zoom's chat feature. I should also note that we have an article on FPRI's website, which I wrote on the peace process between Turkey and the PKK. I'm actually putting it in the chat section, and for those of you who are interested, you can also take a look at that article. With that out of the way, Gönül and Giran, welcome. It's really a great pleasure to have both of you here with us today.
Thanks for having us, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
Gönül, let me start with you. Before we jump into details, let's first set the record straight, as they say. How should we really describe what is happening at the moment between Turkey on one side and the Turkish government and the governing coalition on the other side? Is it a peace process? Is the phrase peace process a correct way of describing what is happening? Or are we just, mainly or basically seeing some sort of a counter-terrorism, effort by the Turkish government? And the reason I'm saying this, as you very well know, is that at least, from the bulk of the statements from Turkish officials up until very recently, they really like to phrase this as some sort of an ongoing counter-terrorism campaign. And, Turkey never really stopped bombing the PKK up until today.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. Thanks for inviting me and putting this together. With regards to the framing of the talks between Abdullah Öcalan and the government, there's a lot of confusion. And I think that confusion really reflects the gap between visions among actors involved. So from Erdogan and his nationalist ally, Devlet Bahçeli's point of view, this is just a unilateral attempt by the PKK to lay down its arms and disband itself. And if you look closely at what Abdullah Öcalan's recent statement reveals, and I'm sure Turkish intelligence and Turkish government officials closely vetted the wording of that document, it pretty much sounds like a unilateral decision, or that's what Abdullah Öcalan is asking the PKK to do. Just lay down your arms. The times for war, a conflict is over. Convene a congress and disband yourself. And that's how it reads, that's how it sounds. Of course, the big question mark is, but what will the Kurds get in return? What will the PKK get in return? So there's a confusion there. And I think this is deliberate. From the get-go, unlike in the previous Kurdish openings, Erdogan did not own this initiative initially. This is not the first one. There had been previous attempts in the past that were led by President Erdogan himself to address the Kurdish question in 2009 and later in 2012, 2013, and they all collapsed. And Erdogan learned a lesson from that, and that was he was the public face of the previous Kurdish openings, and that cost him nationalist votes, right? So that's why with this new initiative, he wanted to make sure that he was treading cautiously. So that's why whenever he spoke about the talks with Öcalan, he made sure that this was an initiative led and launched by his nationalist ally, Devlet Bahçeli. He never publicly owned it until recently. So that was his effort to make sure if things go south that it was not going to be on him. If you talk to Devlet Bahçeli, the way he talks about this talks is very much, he sees this, okay, the PKK has basically lost, it's lost the military fight, and Kurdish people they want peace. We need peace, so the PKK should disband itself and lay down arms. So it is pretty much, it sounds like a counter-terrorism initiative, right? And then there is the pro-Kurdish party side of things, DEM party. And when they talk about these talks, they refer to the necessary conditions, necessary steps that need to be taken by the government for this to succeed. And they talk about a democratic context, a legal context. So that's what they demand. So looking at those various actors and the way they frame this whole thing makes me skeptical about the future of this. I know every actor involved, they have their own reasons to be pushing for this. For President Erdogan, I think the main driver is that he wants to stay in power beyond 2028. And he wants to secure the support of the pro-Kurdish party in the parliament to make that happen. So that's his primary goal, although there are regional drivers behind this too, but the domestic one is his primary goal. If you look at it from Abdullah Öcalan's point of view, he has his own reasons. He's been in jail for many years, and I think he genuinely thinks that, you know, this is we cannot continue like that, and he wants this peace to be his legacy. And if you look at it from the PKK's point of view, they have their own reasons too. I mean, yes, militarily they've lost the fight. Turkey has been waging this very effective fight, particularly in northern Iraq, and also inside Turkey. The PKK hasn't really launched a big-scale attack because they have been militarily weakened, right? And also, the PKK has for a long time enjoyed a lot of support among Turkey's Kurdish community, but that support also has been waning since 2015, and that was when the PKK carried its fight from the mountains into big cities, and that fighting destroyed cities, cost lives. So the people of the region, they really do want peace. And also making things more complicated for the PKK is the developments in Iraq and in Syria. In Iraq,
we'll get to the regional aspect of this ongoing process in Turkey, which is very interesting. But let me interrupt you there and go to Giran. Giran, just going back to what I basically asked Gönül, why are we having this process right now? Militarily, Turkey appeared to be, quite successful in driving PKK guerrillas out of Turkish territory. And it seemed to have the upper hand, mainly thanks to its advanced drone technology against the PKK in Iraq and the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF in Syria, which Ankara considers to be an extension of the PKK. So what is it that is motivating Turkey to pursue peace with the PKK at this moment? And does the Kurdish side really trust the government to fully follow through with this process?
So again, yeah, I would like to also extend my thanks for the organization of the panel. But I think my initial response might not fall very much within the scope of the first part of this panel, but there have been two main reasons that have been highlighted by many Turkey analysts, and I think Gönül just underlined one and was just about to move on to the second. But as I said, the scope of maybe the first part focuses more on the domestic side in Turkey. But in all honesty, for me, I do believe that the regional dynamics had more of an impact, and that's why it took time for Erdogan to be convinced to be a part of the discussions, and he took ownership of the process after it came to a certain place, and that's why even now, while this process is going on, within the borders of Turkey, we're not seeing much movement, much change. We're not actually understanding what this process in itself means for the Kurds in Turkey. What we're seeing way more of is what it means for the Kurds in Syria. And it seems as if this process started with Syria and might end with Syria. If you look at what is going on inside Turkey, there seems to be a slow walking of the process for within the borders of Turkey. But when we look across the border into Syria, we're seeing much more a faster pace of developments, which are directly connected to the process that was initiated within the borders of Turkey. Now, what the motivations might be here, and I think I agree with most of what Gönül said, but on the PKK, on the Kurdish side, this is very well outlined by Öcalan himself in the statement that he made, and a very tiny detail at the very end of that statement, which was a handwritten note that was read out by Sırrı Süreyya Önder, who was part of the committee that went and met with Öcalan in İmralı Island, was that the government needed to take steps legally and democratically. There needed to be legal and democratic amendments for the PKK to continue with its Congress of Disarmament. That literally was the only practical demand on Öcalan's side. Now, there's been a lot of assessments and a lot of analysis that maybe Öcalan forsake or for he pushed aside Kurdish demands, and what this means for the Kurds. A lot of people maybe were critical of that statement, saying, well, he's essentially let go of any Kurdish demand. But I would really push back on that a little bit, because to me, and if you look at the picture inside Turkey right now, demanding democracy might be the most radical demand anyone can make. That being the only, literally without the whole statement, the only practical concrete demand on the government from Öcalan is democratization. Now, what does this mean directly for the Kurds? Is practically about the same as what it means for everyone else in Turkey. But for example, I'm in the UK right now, and the only reason Scotland can have an independence referendum is because the UK is a democratic country. Now, if, this is still, a long shot maybe at this point, but if this process could democratize Turkey to a certain degree, then if and when the Kurds have separate demands, these could be made through a democratic system in the country. Looking at it today, this does seem highly unlikely and a bit of a pipe dream, but essentially in that statement, that was the only demand. And the motivations, as Gönül also outlined, on the PKK side, there's this acceptance that the PKK was not militarily going to defeat Turkey. Whether that was ever the actual objective is a separate matter, but both sides were simply not going to be able to militarily eradicate this issue once and for all. And that acceptance after almost 5 decades is probably one of the main reasons as to why we see this now, if we're just talking about the domestic dynamics inside Turkey. And I said, I think the regional dynamics are a bit more of a motivator than any domestic considerations at this point. And the only reason I say that, and I know this is maybe a bit of a controversial view right now, is that Erdogan, judging by his actions now, by imprisoning İmamoğlu, for me, that's such a radical move. It almost seems as if Erdogan might not even need constitutional amendments or any other support to change his pathway to staying in power in Turkey.
Let me stop you there. That's a really good segue to my next question for Gönül. Gönül, these talks, coincide with a heightened state of domestic tensions in Turkey, and we have had the major opposition figure Ekrem İmamoğlu being arrested by Erdogan's government. How is this growing rift between Turkey's two main political blocs, the governing Justice and Development Party, or AK Party, and the Republican People's Party, or CHP, how is this growing rift between them affecting the ongoing peace process between the government or the PKK and the PKK?
Well, it is certainly complicating things, and we understand that by looking at Devlet Bahçeli's unease with the whole thing, right? Devlet Bahçeli has written several articles, opinion pieces since İmamoğlu's arrest, urging the PKK to convene its Congress, and demanded from the government that, just either yesterday or the day before, he said that whatever you decide to do with İmamoğlu's case, just make sure that you make it quick, because in his mind, the longer this chaos continues between Erdogan and the CHP, and there are still street protests in the country. There's a strong demand for change. So it's right now, things are very chaotic. And from Devlet Bahçeli's point of view, this is really stalling the talks, because we had heard right after Öcalan's statement that the next move was going to be for the PKK to convene its Congress, and then party representatives said that was going to happen imminently, and it didn't. And I think, in my view, what's been happening post İmamoğlu's arrest really had an impact on that. And Devlet Bahçeli, that's why he's very nervous, because Devlet Bahçeli, in his mind, he thinks this is going to be his legacy too. And going back to what Giran said, he said, you know, regional dynamics are the primary drivers. Well, that could be the case from Devlet Bahçeli's point of view. But I don't see Erdogan, I mean, Erdogan being Erdogan, anything that happens in the country or on the foreign policy front, it's first and foremost about Erdogan wanting to consolidate his own power. Right now, he's facing a giant problem, which is the problem of him not being able to run again in 2028. So when he's facing a problem like that, I don't see how regional developments would be the first thing on his mind. And besides, toppling of the Assad regime, Trump's return to the White House, all these things had a dramatic impact on Syrian Kurdish calculations, Ankara's calculations vis-a-vis Syria. But the talks with Öcalan had started long before those talks. So I still think that domestic drivers were the key. But yes, so right now we don't know what will happen. The DEM party group, they spoke with Erdogan recently, and now they will talk to others in his cabinet, and they are now giving a deadline, talking about late April, early May. Some things will happen, and in June they will finalize the process. But to me, as someone sitting here observing from the outside, it's just not clear to me what that framework is about. And Giran said, you know, demanding democracy is the most radical demand in Turkey at the moment. And I completely agree with that. And that's why I'm skeptical, because you cannot expect an autocrat who wants to consolidate his autocracy to deliver democracy and human rights. And democracy and human rights are at the heart of Kurdish fight.
Thank you, Gönül. Giran, it seems to me that the broader Kurdish movement in Turkey is really facing a very serious dilemma. And by the broader Kurdish movement, I mean, you know, the PKK, DEM party, and, you know, the Kurdish civil society in the country. Do they think, given the circumstances that you know, we are witnessing in Turkey, that Kurds can actually get a deal, and more importantly, a lasting deal with the AK Party's government, given how Erdogan is now treating, you know, his major opposition party?
So history tells us that there is no such thing as a lasting deal with the AKP government, with Erdogan. Throughout his tenure, throughout his time in government, Erdogan has made deals with different segments of society across spectrum in the Turkish political spectrum until they have been politically expedient. And this is another moment of political expedience for him, for sure. I don't think that is up for debate at all. I mean, I definitely have long lost my naivety in that sense, expecting governments or states to make choices like this beyond political expediency. I don't expect any benevolence or any sincere benevolence on their part. But making a deal with Erdogan, it might not be lasting. But on this front, and the broader struggle for democracy in Turkey has to be seen, in my opinion, as a you know, there are multiple fronts. It is not just a single frontier for democracy, but there are multiple fronts to push back against the authoritarian government. And the Kurdish issue is one amongst many. And one of the severest fronts, if I may say so. There are, you know, and I think most of our listeners will know as well, the Kurds are generally, throughout the history of the Turkish Republic, have been at the tip of the spear. Whenever there is an authoritarian downturn in Turkey, the Kurds have historically borne the brunt. So they are very well aware that there is a downturn. There is you know, there's democratic backsliding has occurred for decades. there is a significantly scarier authoritarian trend right now, to the point where the founding party, the CHP, the founding party of the Turkish Republic, its presumptive presidential candidate has been put behind bars. In all honesty, as someone that has worked on and pushed back against the Turkish government's authoritarianism, even I did not expect that Erdogan really could pull this off. And there is definitely resistance, and people are still on the streets, as Gönül says. But he did it, and that for me was huge, and quite scary. But in response to your question, yes, making this deal with this government is definitely not ideal, and is concerning that a government that is willing to do this to its own people, to the legitimate opposition in the country, how much human rights and democracy could it promise to the Kurds? And that's why I think one of the best things that Öcalan did in his statement was to not make this about the Kurds, but make this about the whole country. And that's why, despite what's going on, the broader struggle against authoritarianism in Turkey, that this should be seen as a front in that battle to push back against the oppressive authoritarian government, and not separated from the broader response or the broader resistance to Erdogan's authoritarian tendencies. Well, that have gone beyond just tendencies at this point.
Let me ask you this follow-up question to that, Giran. Given what we are witnessing at the moment, and given the history of the relations between the Kurds and Erdogan's government, and Erdogan's own history over the past couple of decades, is there any sense of concern among Kurds in Turkey, and especially those involved in this process, that even if they achieved a deal with Erdogan's government, if things came to change in Turkey, and AK Party and Erdogan were no longer in power, do they worry that they might face some sort of a backlash from other major political forces in the country, be that the CHP, MHP, E Party, or even some of the more or less liberal forces in the country in the future?
I think no one really can guess or see the future in that regard. I mean, we live in the United States, and a change of government here has had drastic effects on people's lives and the country's orientation, both domestically and globally. We have in Europe neo-fascist, ultra right-wing parties that are on the verge of winning the plurality in a lot of national elections. So I don't think anyone really can say either way whether the next administration in Turkey will take revenge on the Kurds. I don't think there's that much of a risk right now, because, and I hate to joke around about this, but there's not much of a risk of a change of regime in Turkey anytime soon, given the current conditions. So I don't think that in itself can be a concern that the Kurds can have at this point. The Kurds have had a century's worth of experiences with different kinds of government, whether Islamist or Kemalist, secular. So I don't think that can be a primary concern at this point. But just to underline my initial point, I just think as the Kurds go through this process, as people who still have tens of thousands of people, there are tens of thousands of Kurds, Kurdish political activists, journalists in prison right now. This is a life and death matter for a lot of Kurds, and I don't, in no way, Gönül is a friend, and I know this is not her position, so it's definitely not a response to her, but in no way can really anyone expect the Kurds to put this on hold while there is a broader resistance against authoritarianism in Turkey. And this should just be seen as the resistance against authoritarianism in Turkey has multiple fronts. This is one of them, and this is you know, we don't know what it will result in right now, but to pursue this, to end the violence and to push back against the Turkish state's criminalization and militarization of this issue is a front worth fighting for, even in and amongst all of this broader clashes over Turkish democracy.
Gönül, I wonder what are, your thoughts on that as someone who has her finger on the, pulse of Turkish politics. Are you seeing any sort of changes, shifts in the public mood in Turkey, especially among those who support, CHP and the opposition to Erdogan? That what the Kurdish movement is basically doing in Turkey in terms of trying to reach a deal with Erdogan, is something that is not seen positively by them.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot of pushback I've seen from people who had backed previous peace efforts, government's peace efforts with the Kurds, and now they are not only skeptical, but they are critical. And I think a bit unfairly. I understand Giran's point, and I'm someone who has backed Kurdish political movements fight for democracy and human rights for many decades now. So I've always been sympathetic to their democratic demands. And I'm not saying, to Giran's point, I'm not demanding that. Imagine Erdogan just woke up one day and went through the list of Kurdish demands. So what are they? They want the redefinition of citizenship along civic lines in the constitution, language rights, right? Amnesty for political prisoners. So there are clear Kurdish demands there, democratic demands. So if Erdogan one day wakes up and says, look, Kurds, I'm willing to give you all those that you've been asking for. I'm not asking the Kurds to say, no, thank you. But I'm skeptical that Erdogan will do that. And there is, if you look at his track record, we spoke about previous efforts, right? In 2009, for example, that was a historic moment in Turkish politics, in Kurdish politics as well. That was the first Kurdish opening, right? So what was Erdogan's primary driver? He had lost a Kurdish vote. He was losing ground among the Kurdish constituency, and he wanted to regain that. So that was the primary driver of Erdogan, right? And then there were regional developments which kind of pushed things further, but they weren't the main driver, and it collapsed. And in 2012, yes, what was happening in Syria was certainly, it had a huge impact on Erdogan's decision making, but his number one driver was the fact that he wanted to switch from the country's parliamentary system to an all-powerful presidency, and he thought that Kurds could be his allies, and that was why he launched the second Kurdish opening. And then it failed because he was not willing to give what Kurds had demanded. Kurds held up their end of the bargain, by the way. The PKK started withdrawing from Turkish territory. It was Erdogan who was unwilling to do what he was supposed to do. So that's why that past experience tells me that this time around he's going to use the Kurds to get what he wants, and in return he's not going to give anything meaningful. That's my worry, and I completely agree with Giran that this is a democratic fight, and there are multiple fronts. The Kurdish front is one of the strongest, but Erdogan is trying to drive a wedge between those multiple fronts, right? So I think part of his agenda here is to drive a wedge between the Kurds, the pro-Kurdish party, and the rest of the opposition. But what makes me hopeful is that Kurdish constituency, Kurdish people are wise enough. I just saw this public opinion poll asking people in the Kurdish region whether they would support Erdogan, vote for Erdogan, and an overwhelming majority said no, because they don't trust him. So yes, that's Erdogan's plan, to drive a wedge between different, and it's working to some extent. I mean, if you look at CHP, some people affiliated with the CHP, they are very critical of the fact that Kurds are now then parties speaking with Erdogan. But I think on the level of people, voters, that's a different story, which is promising, I think.
Thank you, Gönül. Now let's get to the regional dimension of this really highly complex and complicated process. Giran, you were recently in the region. I know that you visited Israel, maybe other countries in the region as well. Can you please tell us what is the sense in the region about this renewed peace efforts in Turkey? Is it something which is which they welcome, or is it something that worries other regional actors, especially given Turkey's quite assertive, if not aggressive, regional posture over the past decade or so?
I mean, firstly, I think everyone's response to the peace process regionally, I don't think anyone actually, firstly, even if they did not approve of a peace process, could not really make that a publicly viable position. But I'd say this, yes, in my recent visit to the region, everyone's primary focus was Syria. And I'm now glad that we're moved on to this part, because that's so overwhelming. You can see that with everyone that you talk to, especially in this time when we're talking about the future of Syria. We're talking about the spirit of Syria. That is all up for debate right now. What kind of Syria we are going to come out with after the collapse of the Ba'athist regime is up in the air, and there are multiple forces, both on the ground but global forces too, who have a stake in that, who are very interested in what kind of Syria emerges from all of this, both political and physical rubble, which a lot of the country is still suffering from. So whether it's Israeli officials who obviously have a border with Syria, and some of that border that I was able to visit, there are houses within a stone's throw from each other, pretty similarly to the Lebanese border. So again, who governs Syria and what kind of military capabilities they have is something that Israeli officials take a keen interest in, and they have put forces on the ground and are upholding their own policies and sustaining their policies in Syria, which, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, can contact and have destructive contacts with Turkish designs and Turkish visions and Turkish interests in Syria. So everyone's focus is definitely on the Syria that is going to emerge from the 15-year conflict. Now, what we're talking about and the peace process that we've mentioned, the impacts it has had on Syria have been profound up until now, even though there really isn't a whole deal of concrete results to talk about. Just the preliminary discussions between the SDF and al-Shara's transitional government in Damascus have largely been credited to Öcalan's intervention. Öcalan's statement, a letter has been talked of, actually confirmed, but even phone calls have been reported on. Whether Öcalan and General Mazlum had a phone call, I don't think has been confirmed, but definitely has been reported on. So his interventions in what is going on, especially in northeast Syria, have been very profound up until this point. And we come here after a few years of questioning Öcalan's influence over the PKK, how much influence he still had after 26 years of essentially solitary confinement. But the last few months, if nothing else, has proven that this man, Abdullah Öcalan, is still the leader of his movement and is still capable of influencing both the military and political components of the PKK, whether that's in Iraq, whether it's in Turkey, and now whether that's with the SDF in Syria. So a lot of people are taking a keen interest in what's going on in Syria, so they have to take a keen interest in what's going on in Turkey. And I think for the last 15 years, we've seen that what happens in Turkey or what happens in Syria does not stay in Turkey or in Syria. There is a connection there that no one can disregard, especially during this process that we're going through right now.
Gönül, given what Giran also just said, how do you think achieving peace between the PKK and the Turkish government would affect Turkey's regional position, especially given, the quite significant geopolitical shifts that we have seen since October 7, such as the weakening of the Iran-led axis in the region and Israel's growing regional influence. How would peace between Turkey and the PKK and the SDF would affect Turkey's position and standing in the regional, geopolitics?
Well, I think, as Giran said, what's been happening in Syria has been closely tied to what Erdogan wants to do at home. So today, Öcalan talks is no exception. I think if that opening succeeds, that will have tremendous impact on the Syrian Kurdish front. And it already has, actually. I mean, if you look at the Turkish government statements regarding the PYD and the Syrian Democratic Forces, even the wording has changed dramatically in a positive way. And Amber'in Zaman had this wonderful interview with Mazlum Kobani just recently, where Kobani said that the fighting, the bombing from the Turkish side had stopped. So yes, whatever happens to these talks between Erdogan and Öcalan will have an impact on domestic dynamics here. And Erdogan wants to cultivate, he wants to bank on what could happen there. In Iraq, for example, Erdogan has a big agenda. There are a lot of things that he wants to do in Iraq. When Erdogan looks at Iraq, he sees a sea of a lot of opportunities there, right? So he wants to cultivate closer ties, defense ties with Baghdad, closer energy and trade ties. And he has this huge ambition of developing the Iraqi development road. And there's a lot of money to be made by companies close to Erdogan. And one can never really disregard that aspect, I must say. Even in Syria, I think when Erdogan and people around him look at these countries, the first thing they see is a huge business opportunity. And Iraq, they understand that the PKK's space, political, military, and diplomatic space has been shrinking for the PKK, right? Americans will be withdrawing soon. And since October 7th, Iranians have been, that their influence has been weakened. So Erdogan sees an opportunity in Iraq, but the only problem in his mind is the presence of PKK. So if he resolves the PKK issue, that will open him further doors in Iraq. So that's what is on his mind. And in Syria, obviously, Syria is also again, it's full of opportunities for him. But something needs to be done about the Syrian Democratic Forces. But what I'm not sure is whether, yes, there have been talks between Damascus and SDF, and even recently some dramatic developments have happened. But I'm not sure whether that gap can be closed, because the Syrian Kurds are they are clear in their demands. They want a decentralized, and even they utter the word federalism, right? So they want federalism. They want their military forces to be integrated into the Syrian National Army as a bloc. So those are clear demands that I think they are considered red lines by Ankara. And given how influential, how much influence Turkey wields over Damascus, although those negotiations are good news, but I don't know if they can reconcile those differences. So I think that will be key in the coming weeks and months. We should also be looking at what's happening on the Syrian front to understand what might happen between Öcalan and the government.
Gönül, let's get to the implications of this ongoing process for U.S. policy. The U.S. has been really notably quiet and silent about these developments in Turkey. Why is that? I mean, why one would wonder or think, that given that Turkey is an important American ally, yes, the relationship has not been easy, but Turkey is still an important American ally. And the Kurds in the broader region have a very positive attitude and working relationship with the U.S. as well. Why the U.S. Has been really quiet about this process?
I mean, if you're asking about the Trump administration, I think the answer is clear there, right? They have no interest in what's happening inside others' borders. But the Biden administration did, in fact, had an interest in what was happening. They had a narrow interest, I must say. They weren't concerned about the Democratic Front, what Erdogan was doing to Turkey's democratic future and all that. But their narrow influence, their narrow focus was on what was happening between the Kurds and the Turkish government, because that would have a direct impact on their plans for Syria. And let's remember, it was under Biden administration that both CENTCOM and State Department officials started devising plans for US withdrawal. And that's why they started moderating these talks between the Syrian Kurds and Damascus. This was long before toppling of the Assad regime. So the Americans are, I think, getting ready to withdraw from Syria, and I see that more clearly with the Trump administration. So the question is, they want to make sure that they leave a Syria where ISIS won't emerge again and Iranian influence is curbed. And this administration looks at Ankara and sees a partner that can do that, right? And that's what Ankara's talking points have been. Turkish government officials are saying that, you don't have to worry about Iran in a post-Assad Syria. You don't have to worry about ISIS. We will take care of that. And you don't have to worry about your Syrian Kurdish partners either, because we are in talks with our own Kurds. So all those talking points are very appealing to this US administration. So I think that's why I think, yes, Americans will withdraw. And that could have factored into the Syrian Kurdish plans to advance these negotiations with Damascus.
Giran, before coming to you, let me remind our audience that they can post their questions in the chat function, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. Giran, you have spent quite some time in the US. You know the political landscape here very well. The actors who are, concerned with the Middle East. If you were advising US policymakers, what kind of recommendations would you offer them regarding the peace efforts in Turkey, the broader significance and meaning and implications of it for the region, and why the US should be engaged?
Well, I mean, essentially, it just hits so many nails on the head for US regional interests. Firstly, I don't know if we can say this very outwardly right now, but Turkish democratization should be important for NATO, not just the US. If it's an alliance, if it's still an alliance of values, then that's right up there. As Gönül outlined, the implications for Syria are profound, and so encouraging that is, as I said in my earlier response as well, I mean, these aren't radical things to do, to acknowledge and welcome a peace process in a country that has suffered from this violence for almost half a century is a no-brainer, really. And so if I was advising this administration, if nothing else, statements welcoming this process, encouraging both sides, and not just the Turkish government, but also the Kurdish side, encouraging the Kurdish side that this is a very welcome process and needs to be taken to its conclusion this time, should be well within the parameters of the State Department's mission. And unfortunately, both in the US and in European capitals, we're seeing a lack of an interest in engaging with this issue at all. And I was just speaking to the Foreign Office in the UK. I don't believe, may have missed it, but I don't believe there has been a single official even acknowledgement of the process inside Turkey. Maybe that comes from a lack of hope here in European capitals too, but encouraging the Turkish government, encouraging Kurdish actors, political and military actors, that this is the best course of action is well within the scope of any foreign ministry, both in Europe and in the US State Department. What this means for Syria and what Syria still means for both Europe and the US is important. If we still have the mission outlined from the Defeat ISIS coalition, ISIS, as Gönül said, is possibly resurging. There are signs that while in broader areas in Syria, their number of attacks have gone down, but in the Kurdish regions and even across the border in Iraq, you can see a slight uptick in ISIS attacks. And this transitional period over the next few months and possibly years is going to be critical. And at this point, if I was again advising the US administration, it just seems to me and to a lot of people that there simply is no rush to withdraw US military personnel from Syria right now. And I think I've heard some CENTCOM commanders say this, and some administration officials also saying that there simply is no more threat to American military personnel in Syria right now. So there's no urgent need for the US to put this at the top of their agenda and withdraw their military from Syria anytime very soon. I've also seen the reporting that there are some preparations, maybe a downsizing of its presence, but quite simply put, at this point, neither domestically or in terms of regional security, there doesn't seem to be much of a rush or a political benefit for the Trump administration.
Thank you. Well, it seemed that our audiences, have not sent us any questions so far, and they are enjoying just listening to the two of you. So given that we have a few minutes left, I'm going to ask a couple of more questions. This is for both of you. Given your expert level familiarity with Turkey, the political and social landscape in the country, Turkey's regional policies, the history of the Turkish-Kurdish relations, Turkey PKK relationship over the past several decades. What are the chances of success of this ongoing, peace process or ongoing talks between the government of Turkey and the PKK and the broader Kurdish movement in the country? Gönül, you can go first.
Yeah, again, I'm not very optimistic because I've seen, I've observed Erdogan way too many years to now put faith in his in this opening. He's made so many U-turns in the past, and the most dramatic one for me was in 2015. So 2015 was the year that came right after Kobani protests in 2014. Remember when ISIS was about to capture Kobani, thousands of people took to the streets in protest. And I think that was the first instance when Erdogan realized that he was not gonna secure backing of the Kurds for his presidential dreams. And then came Selahattin Demirtas, who's been in prison since 2016. And Demirtas said, we're not gonna make you president. So that was a critical moment. And in that afternoon, as Selahattin Demirtas was saying this, Turkish officials were making preparations to hold these talks at the Dolmabahce Palace between Turkish officials and Kurdish officials. And Erdogan was so involved in everything to the point, and I have this in my book, he even he made the seating arrangements himself. But after Selahattin Demirtaş's call, Erdogan said, I don't know anything about these Dolmabahçe meetings. So that was a very critical moment that suggested he can make a U-turn anytime. So even if they make an agreement with the Kurds today, there is no guarantee that he's not going to make another U-turn tomorrow. So that's why I remain skeptical.
Giran, I just noted that we have actually two people who want to ask questions. David Blackman. You can go ahead and ask your question. Christine, can we help allow David to ask a question? David?
David, if you can type your question into the Q&A.
Okay, so they have to type.
So
Yeah.
let me
Yeah,
just
David and Vladimir, you can go ahead and type your questions. Thank you. Giran, if you could answer, that question about like what are the overall chances of success of this process, considering and given, everything that you know.
So I'm going to be only just slightly, a little less skeptical. And my reason will be that I do believe that we're in a different time, both regionally and domestically than 2015 inside Turkey. First and foremost, I believe the leader of the CHP, Özgür Özel, his approach and public statements have been incredible. I think he's actually done a brilliant balancing act in that right now you have a Turkish government that, for whatever reason, is engaging with this process with the PKK and its leader Abdullah Öcalan. But instead of a main opposition party that's heavily critical of the process, Özgür Özel is saying that they would be the better option to pursue a peace process with. So we have in Turkey right now a government and the main opposition both competing over who, objectively speaking, both competing over who can solve this issue better, who is more trustworthy in solving this issue. That is a different climate that we have. And I also believe that regional issues have pushed us to a point where, for both sides, this is, just the military aspect of it is just no longer viable for both sides. And that's why I think the circumstances dictate somehow the demilitarization of this issue, even if it's not the eventual solution and the rights demands that the Kurds are making are not met, then at the very least, a demilitarization of the issue, and then the struggle for democracy continues, the struggle for human rights continues. But if this process in itself leads to a demilitarization and a desecuritization of the Kurdish issue, maybe I'm being wildly optimistic and trying to put a silver lining somewhere, is that would still be a benefit. But then again, the struggle for democracy and human rights will continue in a demilitarized and hopefully desecuritized environment.
Thank you so much. We're just about out of time. Let me warmly thank Gönül and Giran again for sharing their terrific insights today and helping us make sense of a really highly complex and complicated situation. And thanks to all of you in the audiences for joining us today. A big shout out also to the wonderful team at FPRI for making this webinar possible. You can later watch the recorded version online on YouTube. I also hope that you will consider becoming a member or partner here at FPRI and continue to support the great work that we are doing. If you want to know more about what's going on at FPRI, please check out our website at www.fpri.org. Thank you so much, everyone, again for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.